Hey, what's going on, fans of the GBA? My name is Manatui, your host for the GBA Season 5 weekly recap. I do apologize for the lack of a recap last week. Time restraints got in the way, and it was just a little bit hectic, and we were unable to really cover the games as in-depth as we would have liked to, so I do apologize for that. However, myself and Slyra are both here to cover the semifinal matches that occurred during this week of the GBA. And with that being said, Slyra, please introduce yourself.
Hey guys, Cyro here, of course joining Monotui for this week's weekly recap.
Yep, like I said, we will be covering the semifinal matches that occurred. There are only two, so this is going to be a very short video. You'll see at the end, we don't have an entire top 10 playoff MVP race, but we have a little bit towards the end that I hope you guys stick around for. But without further ado, let's just get into the matches. We're going to start off with the match between the San Francisco Arcaniners, of course coached by George, and the Cincinnati Loudreds, coached by Mulvone. George brought his Megalopunny, Crawdaunt, Rotom, Gothitelle, Nidoqueen, and Bronzong, whereas Mulvone brought his Mega Manectric, Landorus Therian, Forretress, Azelf, Dusknoir, and Gastrodon. This was a very good match. George is going to lead off with his Rotom, as Mulvone leads with his Mega Manectric. George, knowing he can take any hit, just hits the Mega Manectric with a Will-O-Wisp, as Mulvone hits it with a Flamethrower. Mulvone went first, so the Rotom is confirmed to not Scarf for Mulvone. After this, Mulvone is then going to Volt Switch out into his Gastrodon as the Rotom goes for a Pain Split, getting a lot of its HP back. At this point, George goes out into his Gothitelle in order to trap the Gastrodon, but is unfortunately crit burned by a Scald, dealing about 50%. However, George still is able to do what he wants with his Gothitelle, goes for the Energy Ball, and is easily able to knock out the Gastrodon. Mulvone is then going to go out into his Landorus Therian and just kill off the Gothitelle with the U-turn. He does U-turn out into the Mega Manectric as George decides to go out into his Scarf Nidoqueen. Nidoqueen is then going to hit an incoming Dusknoir with Shadow Ball and crits it on the way in, which may have mattered. It may not have been to a KO without the crit, but it is what it is. Dusknoir is then going to fire back with its own crit, hitting the Nidoqueen with a Shadow Sneak, as the Dusknoir then goes down to the next Shadow Ball. Mulvone is then going to go back out into his Landorus and hits and kills the incoming Rotom with two knockoffs despite being Colbur Berry. That was a very good play on Mulvone's part, predicting George to not want to stay in. George is then going to go out into his Crawdaunt as Mulvone goes into his Fortress, as the Crawdaunt actually reveals Substitute, which was very good prep on George's part. Then the Crawdaunt is going to go for a knockoff and deals about 50% to the Fortress as Mulvone goes for the Volt Switch in order to break the Crawdaunt Substitute. Mulvone is then going to go out into a Zelf as George goes out into his Bronzong and predicts probably the Nidoqueen to come in and goes for a Psychic, which of course the Bronzong takes very easily. Bronzong is then going to set up its Stealth Rocks as Mulvone sends in his Fortress, and Fortress is going to Rabbit Spin immediately, not wanting rocks on his side of the field, which does give George a free switch out into his Nidoqueen. Nidoqueen is then going to go for the Flamethrower, and Mulvone doesn't really have a switch in, so he is just going to stay in with the Fortress and stack it off, gaining himself a free switch into his Azelf. George is then going to predict Mulvone very well, predicts the Fire Blast, and stays in with his Nidoqueen and gets off damage with the Flamethrower, breaking a potential sash it may have and just getting damage off on the Azelf. The following turn, George is going to predict the Psychic coming from Mulvone, as he does go out into his Bronzong, which of course does take it very well. However, and this is the part where the match gets even hacksier, Mulvone crits George with the Fire Blast as George sets up his Stealth Rocks. This is fine with George because he is heat-proof and he can live one more Fire Blast and set up the Trick Room and then win with Crawdaunt. However, the Bronzong is then crit again with another Fire Blast, meaning that it is going to go down and things are not looking great for George. George then sends in his Mega Lopunny and goes for the Fake Out on the incoming Landorus T, which fortunately for him, getting a little bit of revenge for the previous crits through the Intimidate, dealing about 40% to the Landorus Therian. Lando then goes for the Superpower, which kills off the incoming Nidoqueen that George just wanted to sack off anyway. Now, Crawdaunt is going to come in and just goes for the Aqua Jet on the Landorus. It would 2-KO anything that came in, and of course it does knock out the Landorus, so good play by George. Azelf is then going to come in and is killed by a crit Aqua Jet. Now, the crit may not have mattered, it was a roll, whether or not the Aqua Jet would have killed. However, this just proves to be a very, very hacksy match. There were crits back and forth between both coaches, hacksy match for each side. But after the Azelf goes down, Mega Manectric is going to come in and is able to take one Aqua Jet and kill the Crawdaunt with a Thunderbolt. However, it has taken too much damage at this point, and now George can send in his Mega Lopunny, goes for the Fake Out, which will be able to knock out the Mega Manectric after the burn damage, and that is going to be a narrow 1-0 in George's favor.
Yes, this is just one of those games where, with all the crits that happen, it's hard to really say if that changed the result of the game outside of maybe some differential. George was really predicting well, and that really played into his favor despite the crits. So the other semifinal match that happened was, of course, between Fizz and the Atlanta Hawluchas and Dan and the St. Louis Rampardos. So Fizz brought his Mega Charizard Y, Tyranitar, Garchomp, Weezing, Chestnut, and Heliolisk, while Dan decided to bring his Victini, Mega Aggron, Jolteon, Quagsire, Sylveon, and Salamence. So Dan is going to go ahead and lead off with that Mega Aggron, as Fizz is going to lead off with his Mega Charizard Y, forcing Dan to switch out first turn. Dan switches into Salamence as the Charizard goes for the Fire Blast, but it does miss. Fizz then decides to switch into Weezing, and Dan predicts the switch and pulls a double into his Aggron. Aggron has enough speed EVs to outspeed the Weezing and goes for the Taunt, meaning that the Weezing can't go for any sort of, Will-O-Wisp or anything like that. And then after this turn, Dan does go for the Stealth Rocks, as Fizz then reveals Fire Blast with the Weezing, dealing a little over 50% to the Mega Aggron. Dan then decides to switch into his Victini as Fizz switches into his Tyranitar. Victini goes for the Brick Break, revealing the Tyranitar's Chapel Berry, still dealing over half damage. Dan then pursues which Victini is easily able to take. Then Dan switches, predicting Fizz to switch in, and he goes into his Jolteon while Fizz sends in his Weezing. Jolteon's then able to fire off a Thunderbolt onto the Weezing and deals really good damage, but Weezing then goes for Pain Split, just getting some health back. Fizz then decides to go into his Chestnut as the Jolteon just goes for another Thunderbolt, easily able to take that. Jolteon then just goes for a Volt Switch, and Dan switches into his Sylveon as the Chestnut then goes for the Leech Seed. Dan then switches out again into his Victini as the Chestnut goes for the Spiky Shield. Dan then goes into Sylveon again as Fizz just Spiky Shields again, trying to get damage off on that Victini. Fizz then just continues to Spiky Shield as Dan finally attacks and goes for the Hyper Voice. Then Fizz decides to switch out into his Charizard Y, takes Rocks damage and the Hyper Voice. Victini then comes in on Dan's side, takes a Flare Blitz from the Charizard Y, but is able to outspeed and kill with the V-Create, taking out the Charizard Y. The Tyranitar then comes in, is able to take a V-Create just barely and sets up some Stealth Rocks. And Fizz protects, hoping that Sand would kill, but it doesn't quite kill the Victini, and then Victini is able to outspeed the next turn and kill with the V-Create. After that, Victini then does die to Sand. After that, Sylveon does come in on Dan's side as Chestnut comes in on Fizz's side. Dan goes for the Hyper Voice as Fizz switches out into his Weezing, and it barely lives. But Sylveon does outspeed and is able to go for another Hyper Voice and take out the Weezing. So then Fizz decides to send in his Heliolisk, Fizz then sends in his Heliolisk and is not able to 2-hit KO with a Hyper Voice, and Sylveon is able to get up a Wish. Then Fizz decides to switch out into his Garchomp on the Sylveon Wish. Sylveon then is able to protect and get his health back, and then as the Garchomp goes for a Poison Jab, Dan switches into Quagsire to take that. Fizz then sends in Chestnut on the Quagsire, but Dan predicts this and double switches into his Sylveon. Chestnut goes for the Super Fang. Chestnut then goes for the Super Fang, and then Sylveon goes for the Hyper Voice. Chestnut lives, gets up a Leech Seed against the Sylveon as the Sylveon wishes, both trying to just get their health back. Chestnut then just goes for the Spiky Shield, trying to keep protecting himself, get some health back, which it does. But then Sylveon is able to knock out the Chestnut after getting hit with another Super Fang. It's able to knock it out. A Quagsire comes in and takes an Earthquake from the Garchomp that was sent in after the Chestnut went down, is able to take another hit from the Garchomp and hits back with an Earthquake. Garchomp is then able to take out the Quagsire. Salamence is able to come in, and Fizz just sacks his Heliolisk. Garchomp comes back in, goes for the Poison Jab, and kills the Jolteon. Salamence then comes in, is hit by a Poison Jab and is poisoned, but Salamence is able to kill the Garchomp with a Dragon Claw, and that finishes the game with a 3-0 victory for Dan and the St. Louis Rampardos.
Yeah, this was a very good game to watch. Dan played absolutely incredibly. I think this And I could be wrong, I'm sure other people have other opinions. I think this is the best Dan has ever played in the GBA. And that is a pretty bold thing to say, especially since he did play well enough last season to make it to the finals as well. But congratulations to Dan. I believe he is the first person in GBA history to reach the finals twice. So, again, congratulations, Dan. Fizz, you had a great season as well, and it's sad to see the Fizz train crash and burn as it did, but again, congratulations, Dan. And okay, with the 2 semifinal matches being covered, we are now going to move on to the top 3 playoff performers of the GBA Season 5 playoffs. In first place, we have Megalopunny of the San Francisco Arcaniners with 4 kills and no deaths, and a +4 differential.
Following that, in second place is Gothitelle for the San Francisco Arcaniners, and Gothitelle has 4 kills and 1 death, making that a +3 differential.
And tied with Gothitelle, we have Victini of the St. Louis Rampardos with 4 kills, 1 death, and a +3 differential as well. Okay, thank you guys very much for watching. Again, we apologize for the short video, but because there were only 2 matches, of course that is going to happen. Less content to cover. But we are going to finish this video off by announcing the finalists. I'm sure if you've watched each of the matches, you know exactly who is in the finals, but in case anyone hasn't, the final match of the GBA, the finals, the championship match, will be played between George of the San Francisco Arcaniners and, by returning championship contender, Dan of the St. Louis Rampardos. So, we are not going to go too in-depth as to who we think is going to win. We want to leave that to you guys. We have 2 questions for you guys. Who do you think is going to win in the championship, and who do you want to win in the championship? Now, who you want to win may not be exactly who you think will win, so again, leave us your responses down below. Do you think George is going to win, but you really want Dan to win? Let us know. Do you think Dan is going to win and you want Dan to win? Let us know. Do you think George is going to win? Do you want George to win? Let us know in the comment section below. We would love to hear your predictions, and that is going to be it for the video. Sly, do you have anything else to say?
Not really. I'm really excited to see this final game. It's going to be really, really exciting. It's going to be such a close match, and I'm really excited to see it, as I'm sure everybody else is.
Absolutely. These are 2 of the best coaches in the league, and it's going to be extremely exciting to see what happens in the final match of the GBA. So thank you guys very much for watching. My name is Mandatui.
My name is Slyro.
And we'll see you next week. Hopefully. I'm not sure if we are, but they don't look